Well, good morning. Why is psychology important? It is very important. This talk today will be about not the psychology of fear, which you would expect, or the psychology of fearlessness, which is also my interest, or what I'm even calling a fearlessness psychology. That to myself, and I think Desh Subba, a leader in the thinking on philosophy of fearism, when we've melted our work together in 2014 approximately, we were really interested in some level that we're attempting to push psychology and philosophy to a very new level of a different way to organize, think about reality, think about human history, think about evolution. And obviously, is this going to be a new psychology that we think it is for the future? So I'm not going to probably talk about fear for the rest of this talk. It's really an introduction to giving an overview of how I come to see this psychology of fearlessness. What are the roots to my thinking? I'm not going to be able to speak for Desh Subba as a leader in the thinking on fear, but I will talk about my roots and organize them to give you just really a kind of really quick course if you want to understand the psychology of Dr. R. Michael Fisher and its roots. So that sort of started through a troubling that I did a few years ago in 2016 or so. Actually, it goes further back than that. It's 2010, I see. Where I was interested in Ken Wilber, one of the integral philosophers of the day, and one of my favorite theorists, talked about the death of psychology. So I titled this paper after his declaring the death of psychology and the revision needed. And I'll get to Ken Wilber's impact later. So that publication is available online if you want to have a look at it. It's a free PDF download. Just to quickly mention the names that I'm going to cover today very briefly who have impacted me on really the rethinking about psychology and the importance of becoming a critical thinker in the world of psychology, because psychology is so important. As one modern history of psychology textbook says, psychologists, I'm quoting, claim as their subject matter some of the most intimate and personal aspects of human experience. Yeah, psychology does, and it's very profound. And today we have so much psychology pouring at us as human beings, trying to negotiate meaning in life, have explanations for life. And also we have to think about the psychology of this incredibly cascading time of crises on the planet, from global warming to mass extinctions, and the psychology for actually extinction of humankind as we come to face this in real ways in the early 21st century. Another reason psychology is really important is, as one journalist said, Haveman, back in 1957, which he really sort of coined and made popular the term the age of psychology that we've entered. That was a series of Life magazines. I'm not going to go into those and over those, but if you want to look at the age of psychology as a search term, he basically discusses how psychology is influencing every aspect of our life in just about every way. Now remember, that's important in contrast to our history, because religion has also done that. In various religions, different parts of the world, it has been, in a sense, the psychology in its own way, without calling itself that and without being, quote, scientific and necessarily, and without being systematic in developing psychological theories, although cultures and religion has psychological theories and inputs into how the nature of the universe is, how we ought to respond, and it influences everything. So there's been this tension, as I just summarized very briefly. There's this tension between science and religion when psychology has started to overcome the influence of religion, and that sort of is a very modern phenomenon, and I would say it's probably started in around the 19th century, and particularly into the early 20th century and so on. So you could go back further into philosophy as well as a type of psychology, And that would be a much longer discussion that I won't be entering in here, because of that requires a lot of philosophical analysis and history of philosophy itself. So psychological age, how to live in it, how to live in it well, and where does psychology need to go, and how does psychology need to critique itself? That last part is where I focus on the people that I'm going to mention today, which are Friedrich Nietzsche, Otto Rank, Harvey Jackins, Abraham Maslow, James Hillman, Fox and Prilletensky, Ken Wilber, and then myself and Desh Subba I'll end this lecture with. So again, very brief overview, kind of like a dragonfly, just dipping into the tops of the water, picking off few bits of information to guide you along a path of inquiry if you were to want to study this. And that's really what this video is for, is to guide you to understanding my particular path of critical psychology. And it's really kind of a meta-psychology, which is the psychology of psychologies, and how to understand that in a critical way so we don't be impacted by just one psychologist or psychology school or discipline. So one more thing about religion and science, this tension. There's a book that said I'm quoting, many have worried that psychology has corrupted American faith, eroded citizens' virtues, and weakened common life. So yeah, that's the new age of psychology I'm talking about, compared to, again, this long trajectory where religion and philosophy to a lesser degree has had such an influence on us understanding ourselves and understanding the world and how to behave and all those things. However, this author also says, interestingly enough, on this bit of history of the religion and psychology together, is that, but however, even though the religious people, scholars, theologians, have been, somewhat ambivalent about psychology's new impacts, this author also says that there's been some great developments in psychology coming in with religion and faith that have bred an improvement, particularly in a more holistic way, you could say, of understanding the human being. And this author lists post-World War II, especially the AA movement, Alcoholics Anonymous, the Salvation Army movement, the clinical pastoral education, where it's kind of a spiritual psychology. And then I would add just one highlight is A Course in Miracles, coming into the 1970s, into the human potential movement, New Age, where religion and psychology very much merged. And that movement, A Course in Miracles, Marianne Williamson, running for American president, is actually one of the ministers of that school of thought. So much of her wanting to bring a moral revitalization to America in her 2020 run for president is actually based on that spiritual psychology. Now, if you wanted to also trace the psychology, it's sometimes called the science of mind, and that will merge with philosophy. And that is that really powerful and intimate understanding of how the human mind works. And that's a pretty potent understanding, a pretty potent pursuit of knowledge that, again, is not necessarily new, it's ancient. However, it's really become systemized and so important in the evolution of consciousness, which is, right, being conscious of how we're conscious about our mind and how it works. And that's not just our mind, it's our psychology, it's our whole body. And I also then want to say is, this one here is the history of psychology has many stories, and not all are disciplinary. So there's a lot of psychology wisdom and knowledge that is not necessarily what you're going to get when you take a psychology course. And that's really important. In fact, most of the major authors I'm going to talk about that have influenced my life, that I've named already, you won't get in your average psychology course or courses in the average mainstream university. And that's really sad. That's a great loss, because as I say, I've had to go into the margins of knowledge, even though these are very powerful and scholarly people, and some you will have heard of, and some are not so scholarly, but very important thinkers in the world of building a psychology of understanding and wisdom and compassion for humans. All right, I think I'm ready to then drop into now to go through this list very quickly for you. Hang in there with me. I wish I could make it more exciting with fancy video, but I really want it to be just simple, and you can get the tracings of this world that I went into. So just discovering more and more about Friedrich Nietzsche, who I have a real affinity for in many ways. Won't go into that in this video. Again, turn of the century, kind of late 1800s, and died in 1900. And Friedrich Nietzsche, famous for his philosophy of which some people call the father of postmodernism. But not getting into that per se, what I was fascinated to see that he talks about in some of his work. In a recent article I was reading on his work by a scholar, is that he actually termed himself as the psychologist of Christianity. In fact, he says, quote, the first psychologist of Christianity. And really, Christianity being Judeo-Christian philosophy, theology, and psychology that was all being brought in by especially the institutional church and religious education in the Western world. And of course, that came from even in Africa, the early Christian thought. But I'm particularly in his critique is because he was European in that 19th century. He really was after a new psychology. And so when he says I was the first psychologist of Christianity, I was really struck by that because I would argue in a way I'm the first psychologist of the age of fear in a big way and in the modern and contemporary way. Get to that later at the end of the video very briefly. Okay, so he went after the psychology of Christianity and was trying to develop a brand new type of not Christianity, hardly. He was quite critical of that, but a new psychology that wasn't just influenced by Christianity. And remember, Christianity was so powerful in influencing history and the notion of how humans developed, right? It was like history was divided in before Christ, BC, to after the death, AD. After the death of Christ, like, it's amazing how that Judeo-Christian psychology and historical sensibility influenced everything. And he was after deconstructing that and building a new psychology. So that's a foundation for me in his thinking. And he was very interested in fear too as well, the effect of it. The next one is Otto Rank. Now, this came about in a book called The Death of and Rebirth of Psychology, where I really was discovering Otto Rank a bit. Era program doing a summary of the major of psychologists after Freud and Rank. Otto Rank, R-A-N-K, was one of the brightest students apparently of Freud, and then split away from Freud because had very different understanding of which direction to go. So Otto Rank comes in with this analysis of psychology and psychoanalysis itself. So remember, he's like a theorist in psychoanalysis. He was doing research in psychoanalysis, and he comes in with this later in his life, this essay about, I don't remember the exact name of it, but anything on Otto Rank, you'll find this, where he basically said is that psychology will not be the answer. So in a way, he was one of the first I know to announce, Nietzsche announced the death of God, to get his new psychology going, a new psychology of human potential, really, and human greatness. And Otto Rank announced really the first inklings of the death of psychology, in that even though it was becoming very powerful in Europe at that time in the 19th century, and again, I can't comment on the rest of the world, how I'm not a scholar on the history of psychology or psychoanalysis, but Rank announces that really psychology will not replace the religion and the, in a sense, the wisdom and understanding and psychology of religion and faith, and how important that is for humans. He believed science was an addition to that religious, spiritual psychology and understanding through faith and all the practices of the church and so on. But he said don't expect it to overcome. Don't expect science to replace. And so he actually was saying psychology is not as great and powerful and wonderful rescuer of humanity, overcoming the superstitions and fears of religion and the silliness of religion. It was just some of the critiques that were going on in the battle of science and religion. Otto Rank, very important. Yeah, he's basically put psychology in its place and said it's very limited. And he also said it's just not going to answer and solve the biggest human problems in this really deep understanding of the human mind and the human body, mind, soul, spirit. The next one you'll probably never have heard of for most people, is Harvey Jackins, 1950s. You've got to go back historically. He came up with a theory of human beings and really a psychology of human beings about how we're hurt and oppressed and how we heal. He moved politics and psychology in a beautiful synthesis. He's greatly influenced my work. I could tell a long story about how I came to understand his theory of reevaluation co-counseling, which is a peer-to-peer helping model. Again, somewhat along the lines of AA and these other movements of how humans have to help each other psychologically, not depending upon, and this was his major criticism, Harvey Jackins, of the professionalization of psychology, and then the research-based psychology that we've seen. Evidence-based is the big term today, that somehow if it's evidence-based psychology, it's the only god of psychology and we ought to follow it as if it's the rule. Well, I can tell you that you can tear that apart very easily, all that stuff, not that it doesn't have some partial truths, and that's really the shallowness or the reductive aspects of modern and contemporary, even neurobiology, which is also being seen as the new God savior. And everybody wants to read books on the brain and neurobiology somehow that's going to explain everything and it's going to be the answer. Well, Otto Rank already said, don't even think it's going to be the solution. Harvey Jackins, I won't be able to go into him further, but a hurting and healing model, which I actually teach today in my LET program, Life Enhancement Training Program. I have videos on that on my YouTube channel if you want to check. So another really major revision psychology, James Hillman in the 70s came along. And this is a marvelous book because he was really arguing that psychology ought not to be just about this individual sense that, the psychology of the individual or even the individual and the social group. Like, he was going way deeper than that. And he comes out of what he calls archetypal psychology. He was naming that in a sort of a post-Jungian transpersonal type of psychology that went much deeper. Again, I can't go into details in any of these in this video. That would be a much longer video. Really important thinker for our time. And I always get so many deep insights. Basically, he said psychology and myth, there's a mythic psychology. And that's a historical psychology through myths that we can utilize through symbols and archetypes, etc. And that's how we'll do the psychology that will help us. And he did a marvelous critique, James Hillman, again here in a conversation on, we've had 100 years of 100 years of psychotherapy, and the world's still getting worse. He wrote this in, I think, 2007 or 4 or somewhere in there, and with another journalist, and it's a great conversation. And again, you can see the criticality, right? The psychologist, which he was, and theorist, analyzing psychology itself. And that's really important. And another one that I don't have the book of, I've never been able to purchase the book, it's by Abe Maslow, coming out in the 60s into the 70s. But in 1966, he published a book called The Psychology of Science. And again, this is that same type of critique of, Otto Rank and Maslow, Abe Maslow, famous in humanistic and transpersonal psychology, father of transpersonal psychology, called humanistic existential psychology, etc. in America. This book, Psychology of Science, is a fascinating book because he basically put science on the couch, and he put even psychology in a sense on the couch, the psychology of science. The science of psychology. interesting how he played with that, and he comes up with 21 cognitive pathologies that he goes into great detail of science and science thinking and science knowledge and how people practice science. And so I love that psychology was being used to analyze the problems of science. And that includes the problems of the psychology that tries to be scientific as well. So Abraham Maslow, really important. And then came along, I discovered in the 90s, mid 90s to late 90s, critical psychology as a field. So, you can study psychology, right? And you could study disabilities, you could study industrial, you could study organizational psychologies, and just about any topic. And that doesn't mean that you're using critical psychology as a context or as a methodology or as a philosophical critique. And these people came along, Fox and Prilletensky, and there's a whole field called critical psychology, which, again, you'll not get this in any mainstream university, I guarantee you. This is way off on the edges, and it's really important. It also has some political edges to it. It probably has somewhat Marxist type slant to it at times, but it's not confined to that. And the whole point is that psychology needs to criticize itself constantly as a critical praxis, as politics. It has a political value system behind science. It's socially embedded. It's socially constructed. It's culturally influenced. There's no science of psychology that does not have those influences. Just if you're taking what I just said, there's no psychology that does not have those political, social, critical, historical, sociological influences. It has its politics. And if you don't understand psychology has those, and you're not taking those into account, you're basically just letting psychology spoon feed you what might be on the surface very useful information, knowledge, helps you, feel better or whatever. However, the whole point I'm making in this video is psychology is powerful, and really powerful, since the age of psychology has invaded in a way, and supportive at the same time, but it has a shadow side, simply. Moving now to ending this video, Ken Wilber's integral psychology is, to me, very powerful. So Ken Wilber is, I would call this the fifth force of the disciplinary schools of psychology that are now available. And again, I'm particularly speaking about the Western, the modern world, so I'm not overgeneralizing about the whole world. But this integral work from an integral philosopher, Ken Wilber himself, an American, started in the 70s writing, or early 70s, and still today a speaker and writer. And I particularly like his early works in the 1996 and earlier. After that, I don't quite like his psychology and politics, etc. so much, but very powerful thinker of a metapsychological theory, a theory of all psychologies. And his work was based, even though he's called the father of transpersonal psychology, if you look up in any dictionary on an encyclopedia of psychology, Ken Wilber, with Abraham Maslow, Robert Ciglio, and Carl Jung, the fathers of transpersonal psychology. Well, let me just organize those for a moment historically. So in this age of psychology, again, kind of the modern period, 19th century, the late, especially mid to late, and there's sort of four major schools, and integral being the fifth school, and which is much less known, much mainstream. Most universities don't talk about Ken Wilber at all in their psychology courses or philosophy courses, etc. But he's had a great influence on all disciplines of knowledge today. If you look up him on the internet, and integral philosophy or integral theory, very powerful. So these four basic schools of psychology, which I've been following and interested in, and trying to situate my work on fear within each of those schools and understand how each of those schools constructs and deals with a certain kind of understanding and psychology of fear, if you will, and more interestingly, psychology of fearlessness. 4 schools are psychoanalysis, and Freud, of course, is famous, and then all his students and the post-Freudians and beyond to Lacan and to Ettinger and others. Then there's the behavioral cognitive schools. You have B.F. Skinner and Watson and others in the behaviorism that also merged with cognitivism, and that is probably the most popular school of psychology today in the mainstream and in clinical practice. It is so-called the most evidence-based, scientific, and et cetera, again, influenced by a lot of new science and neurobiology of cognitivism, how we do cognition, how our mind thinks and works, and so on. Another major, sometimes these are called the waves of psychology, the great forces of psychology, I've seen them called. So psychoanalysis, behaviorism, cognitivism. Third one was humanistic, and sometimes put with existential. Humanistic existential psychology. Abraham Maslow being one of the founders of that, and then many others. And then the transpersonal psychology was the fourth wave, and that's much more coming out of the 60s, 70s, comes out of the kind of psychedelic research, consciousness research, and that very tumultuous, powerful change. And each one of those psychology waves or forces, just like the forces and waves of feminism, the different stages in a way, right, developmentally, are attempting to improve and take psychology to a new level. They're sort of claiming, this part of our psychology is too limited. We need to go to this new, and we're exploring new. So it's very exciting, all these fields. And then Ken Wilber comes along with integral psychology, and he says, well, actually psychology is dead, is what he claimed. As I said, that's where I started that little publication, The Death of Psychology. And then thinking about how integral psychology is really claiming itself as a fifth force. I don't think it's been identified by too many people at all as being that, but I think it is, and I know Ken Wilber does think as well, because it integrates all of the psychologies there and critically looks at their weaknesses and their strengths, and then tries to see how we can apply that as an integral thinker, which is really holistic integral thinking. I'll often use those terms in my literature. If you read my work, holistic integral approach, a critical holistic integral approach to study of fear or fearology, etc. So that gives you a little bit of perspective of mine. And then to end off, I think Desh Subba and I have a couple of concepts that I think are really interesting we came to independently. So he's working as a Nepali writer, thinker, literary person, philosopher, now lives in Hong Kong, and I'm writing and thinking here in Canada. And independently, when we found ourselves in 2014, late 2014, coming together and sharing our work for the first time, it was pretty clear that he has this concept called fearless age. And he tracks out the history of the ages of fear and names them. I think he has 10 or 12 of those stages. And he says the potential we have is the fearless age to emerge after the extreme fear age, which he says we're kind of in that now. And I agree completely. And I have this concept I've been writing about since early in my work, going way back to the early, 1900s. Early 1900s, by that I mean 1995, 1996, and so on, into the 2000s, the Fearless Society. And I kept asking the question, could we imagine and reimagine a psychology, a philosophy, a worldview, a set of values that goes with that worldview for a fearless age, a fearless society per se. So his notion of fearless age and my fearless society really linked very beautifully, I thought. And what does it say? Well, it says we need a new psychology that's not based on fear. fear will be influencing and has influenced human history, as both of us argue in our theories. But this new psychology, what he calls fearism for short, and I would call a fearlessness psychology, they are really a new twist in psychology. So if Nietzsche can be the first psychologist of Christianity in his critique, Otto Rank being the first psychologist to critique psychoanalysis, psychology as not having all the answers, never will, doesn't cover all the domains and can and never will. And Maslow coming along and being the first psychologist of science itself, as I suggested, and then Wilber coming along and being the metapsychologist and critic of all psychologies, and Fisher and Subba coming along and being the first psychologists of fear and fearlessness. And these, I think, if you spend any time exploring some of these people that I've mentioned, and certainly look at my work or Desh Subba's, I really think there's going to be another revolution in how we do psychology and think about psychology, and obviously in the end apply it. And again, in this very intense crisis time we're entering into. But the good news is that we're also just sitting on the edge, the abyss of moving to a whole new psychology of fearlessness. I think that's my conclusion. And it's a conclusion that has lots of openings and holes and porousness to be critiqued and explored, and I look forward to those conversations with you. So thanks a lot for listening to